History is written by the victors. Winston Churchill, Medieval Europe. A land of unwashed knights swinging swords, feasting on rotten meat, believing the earth was flat, guarding chastity-belt-wearing maidens, and inventing nightmarish torture devices. Or at least, that's what we've been told. But the truth, it's a lot more complex. So where did these myths about the so-called Dark Ages come from? And what was medieval life actually like? The Middle Ages typically describes a stretch of time lasting about 1,000 years, from the fall of Rome in the 5th century to the dawn of the Italian Renaissance in the 15th. Although historians have applied the term elsewhere, it's most commonly used to describe Europe, and with it comes a lot of misconceptions. One big myth, that medieval people were ignorant and uneducated. For example, a 19th century biography of Christopher Columbus claimed medieval Europeans believed the world was flat. But that's just not true. In fact, most scholars of the time accepted that the earth was round. One popular 13th century book was even titled On the Sphere of the World. And literacy? It steadily increased during the Middle Ages, especially with the rise of monasteries, convents, and the earliest universities. Ancient knowledge wasn't lost either. Greek and Roman works were still widely studied. Then there's the myth about medieval people eating rotten meat. That idea took off in the 1930s, thanks to a British book that misread a single recipe. It also pointed to laws forbidding the sale of spoiled meat and took that as proof that people regularly ate it. In reality, medieval folks avoided rancid food just like we do. They preserved meat by salting it and took food safety seriously. And those fancy spices, they were so expensive, they often cost more than the meat itself. If you could afford spices, you could afford fresh food. How about hygiene? A 19th century historian named Jules Michelet famously called the Middle Ages 1,000 years without a bath. But that's way off. Even small villages had public bathhouses, and people washed with soaps made from things like animal fat, ash, and herbs. They used mouthwash, scrubbed their teeth with cloths and powders, and chewed herbs to keep their breath fresh. And those terrifying torture devices, like the infamous Iron Maiden? Total myth. In the 1890s, a traveling exhibit showed off supposedly medieval torture devices, including an Iron Maiden. But there's no evidence Iron Maidens existed during the Middle Ages. They were probably invented much later. Even the pear of anguish, often said to be a gruesome torture tool, was likely just a device for stretching shoes. Most actual medieval punishments were fines, imprisonment, public shaming, and occasional corporal punishment. The brutal stuff, like drawing and quartering, was typically reserved for the most serious crimes like treason. And what about chastity belts? Probably a joke. The first mention of them was in the 15th century by a German engineer who also included fart jokes and a machine for invisibility in his writings. Over time, these satirical ideas were mistaken for facts. The way people viewed the Middle Ages has always depended on who was telling the story. During the 15th and 16th centuries, Renaissance scholars coined terms like the Dark Ages to dismiss the era between classical antiquity and their own time. Later, Enlightenment thinkers portrayed medieval people as superstitious and irrational, in contrast to their self-proclaimed Age of Reason. In the 19th century, Romantic nationalists romanticized the Middle Ages, painting a picture of pure, isolated, white Christian societies. They idealized knights and chivalry, even though knights weren't all that important in most medieval warfare. And the Middle Ages were hardly isolated. Trade routes connected Europe to Byzantine, Muslim, and Mongol worlds. Merchants, scholars, and diplomats from all over the world visited European cities, exchanging ideas and goods. The biggest myth of all? That the Middle Ages were one big, unchanging era. In reality, they were a dynamic and diverse 1,000 years of history, and a lot of what we think we know is more fantasy than fact. For more videos, please like and subscribe.